Good morning. As part of our continuing series on the book of Nehemiah, I'd like to share some thoughts on Nehemiah chapter 4. So let's lay the stage. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." So, this is opposition. This is an attack. And Nehemiah needed to do something about it. So what do you do when you face opposition? I think the first thing you'd want to do is understand who the enemy is. Do they have any legitimate authority? And what is your best recourse to protect yourself and prevail? Now, in the case of Nehemiah and the Jews, who had returned to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity, it was the rulers of the region that were opposed to them making any progress in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem so that they could reestablish themselves as a distinct people with their own culture and worship practices versus just being assimilated into the now dominant culture of the region. They had already resisted that for 70 years in the Babylonian captivity. They weren't about to start now. Little background refresher. Sanballat the Horonite was a Samaritan leader and official of the Achaemenid Empire of Greater Iran. Now, in those days, Iran was called Persia. You ever heard of the Prince of Persia? So, what's the meaning of Sanballat? Well, one person wrote, "Sanballat is the enemy of revival and brings strong opposition to what God wants to build." Sanballat is a critical persecutor who brings false accusations against the work and the people putting their hand to the plow. And Sanballat will rally others to the opposition against you, like the Tobiahs and the Greshams, just like he did to Nehemiah. Frankly, our culture today feels like this is what's happening to the church. It feels like we're being assaulted on every side and that we just don't fit in, that we're a little weird, that this whole Jesus thing is really kind of foolish, and that we have no right to assemble or worship if the government decides that it has a different agenda. So let's talk about Tobiah. Now, he was the governor of Ammon, and he was a high-ranking official appointed by the Ammonites when Nehemiah was rebuilding Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. And this was all happening about 445 BC, just to kind of understand the timeline a little bit. Now, Tobiah, of course, was one of the two central figures who mocked, harassed, intimidated, and opposed the rebuilding of Jerusalem. It says in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone would come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. Further on in Nehemiah 2:19, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Gresham the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you're doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." So those pretty bold words. Let's take a look at a little bit of the history behind that statement. The Ammonites were descendants of Lot through his daughter. That's quite a story. You might want to go back to Genesis 19 and read that one. That was a mess. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son, and his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. As for the younger, she also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. That's Genesis 19, 36 to 38. Now here's what's kind of interesting about that. Because, the whole circumstance of their birth was not good. Moloch was the idol of the Ammonites. Now, if you know anything about Moloch, this was this iron statue that they built a fire inside of, and people would bring their infant children and sacrifice them on the arms of the outstretched Moloch. This is post-birth abortion. This is evil beyond evil. It boggles the mind, except for some of the legislation, frankly, we've seen in the last few years about partial birth and post-birth abortion. I wonder what God's opinion is on that. I'll save that for another story another day. So this was obviously incredibly evil, and the Ammonites continued to harass God's people, and frankly, they were rather ecstatic when God's people went into the Babylonian captivity. So their extinction was predicted about 150, 200 years earlier in 600 BC. Quote, I have heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the sons of Ammon, with which they have taunted my people and become arrogant against their territory. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab will be like Sodom, and the sons of Ammon like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The remnant of my people will plunder them, and the remainder of my nation will inherit them. And that's in Zephaniah 2, 8 through 9. So you see, from God's perspective, these rulers, Sanballat and Tobiah, had no true authority. So what was the correct course of action? Well, we know from the New Testament in Ephesians 6:12, it says, For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So Nehemiah and the Jews did the smart thing. They repaired and rebuilt their defenses while defending themselves from possible attack. And that's detailed here in chapter 4. They also called out to God for his protection with prayer. In chapter 6 it says, So we rebuilt the wall till it reached half its height, for the people worked with all of their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. Now you can see from this story that after you've identified the enemy and determined that they have no authority greater than God's in the circumstance, that your role is to do both what you can do and pray to God that He will do what only He can do. It's a cooperative action. It's not passive, it's active, and it involves you. There's things that you can do. I was just reading a post by Cheon a few minutes ago about the victory for H-Rock Church in their appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States against California Governor Newsom's order that closed churches in California against the clear wording of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that protects freedom of religion and assembly. H-Rock won in the Supreme Court appeal 6-3. That's a major victory for the body of Christ in America. Cheon identified the enemy, determined that they had no authority, filed the lawsuit, and prayed to God for favor. During the period of the lawsuit, Che was threatened with fines, the church was threatened with closure, and he was personally threatened with arrest. But he and the church persevered, and God had the victory. It was cooperative. It reminds me of a time when I was younger. I had 3 kids. Joe and Nick were not even born yet. I had recently been promoted at work. At that time, I was a recruiter, a headhunter, if you will. And I was growing as a Christian. I'd been a Christian about 5-6 years by this time. I was starting to volunteer. I was helping at a children's ministry called Awana, helping out with the 3- and 4-year-olds. And then I came down with Epstein-Barr, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome. I felt exhausted and ill to my stomach for about a year before I started to feel better. I really thought, what am I going to do? I've got a young family. How am I going to provide for them? Every thought that you can imagine ran through my head. I mean, this was not good. Now look, I understand that not every disease you contract is fundamentally a demonic oppression. But, as Harold Eberle says, the spirit world and the natural world are closely tied. And sometimes there's a spiritual solution to a natural problem, as there's also sometimes a natural solution to a spiritual problem. It's a cooperative thing. It's an interlaced thing. He tells a story about some demonic activity that was occurring at an abandoned barn near where he lives. Kids were doing unnatural things to small animals, as I recall. So Harold was praying and praying that this would stop, but Linda, his wife, suggested there may be another solution. So Harold followed her advice and went out and fixed the doors on the barn and locked them. Problem solved. Now, I think we'd all agree that Harold also believes in the power of prayer to heal. But this was a situation where it was a natural solution to a spiritual problem, just as much as sometimes praying for somebody's healing is a spiritual solution to a natural problem. The trick is not to try and figure out which one it is to figure out, need to do something. Just make sure you include God in it. So, what was my response to this illness that was threatening the welfare of my young family? I determined that this was, as much as anything, an attack from the enemy. I remember when we were talking about Ephesians 6:12? For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. I then did 2 things. I started with a friend of mine, a software business on the side, and I started to teach myself a very complicated computer language called C, and started to fight against my fatigue by working twice as hard. I would say, devil, you want to take me out? Well, watch this. I am doubling down. So Between my day job and my side gig, I was pretty much working, all day, every day, and half the night, weekends too. Now, of course, I also prayed more. And over the years after I got through that initial first year when I was the sickest, I continued to volunteer more, teach more about God, and learn a few more computer languages, just 'cause. Now, I did start to feel better after about a year, but I had to move on to a new job at a lower position. But I kept working on the side software project that now had morphed to a completely different product with its own unique challenges. I quit my job to work on it full time, and it was a spectacular failure. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But in the midst of that, God was faithful. We had an anonymous check from the bank that covered our rent one month. Somebody else sent money to help out fixing our car. Another time when the kids were ill and Jenny was pregnant and craving citrus, a bag was left on the front door with grapefruit and cough medicine and toilet paper, which, by the way, we were out of. We hadn't said anything to anybody. It was 100% miraculous. One day when the water department came to turn off the water, a check came from one of the families in Jenny's homeschool support group that was exactly the amount of money needed to keep the water and the lights on. And she just sort of had a feeling at breakfast, gee, I think the Mellons need some money. Hey, honey, what do you think? Yeah, I was thinking that too. I have a number in my mind. What number did you have? Oh, about $120. Wow, that's the number I had. And they called up Jenny, sent the check over, and we continued to have water and light. Now, I could go on for a very long time detailing all of the ways that God protected and provided for us through these repeated trials, and there were a lot of miracles and a lot of trials. He did so many things that we actually have a family holiday every year, kind of like Thanksgiving. We call it Arrival Day from when we arrived here in Michigan, where the goal is to thank God for all he did and continues to do in our lives. Now, I can't tell you everything instantly worked out when we prayed. It was about a 7-year battle, both physically, spiritually, and economically. But God was faithful through it all. We never ended up homeless or hungry, though we came close a few times. On the other side of this journey, we moved to Michigan, and I was no longer a recruiter. I was a computer programmer at places like Unisys, MicroAge, and Arbortext. I was making way more money than I had when I had that job as a manager when I was a recruiter, and I had grown so much more in the Lord. I think I probably grew more in those years than in any other. So, as you can see, this was a cooperative action with God to come against an unjust enemy. Just like Nehemiah and the Jews were fighting against unjust enemies, their authority did not usurp the authority of God. Now, it took work, struggle, and prayer, but God had the victory and the devil was defeated in both of these cases. So I guess the question I have for you is, what are you struggling against today? What can you do about it, and what do you want God to do? Identify the enemy, determine what you can do, and pray to God for his favor, and you will overcome and be successful. I guarantee it.